Alright, this is a walk around by request of Mike and also for the benefit of Patrick, who I've been promising for a very long time to show him a few things that I've done to this truck, and I've just never gotten around to it, unfortunately. But this is that Black Beauty motor that I had to build, kind of highlighted on 720 World. It's I call it a 10-to-1 motor. It's probably just a little shy, probably like 9.8 or 9.9 to 1 compression. This has got the flat top K24 pistons in it, some modifications to the valve train. I got a webcam in it, the same, well, it's not the same, but it's a good cam. I've got this stuff all documented somewhere, but it's been so long now since I've worked on this truck, most of this stuff just not coming to me off the top of my head. Old Doug Thurley jet hot coated header, which has held up pretty good over time, and I really like these headers. So much better than a pace setter. It's unfortunate you can't get these anymore unless you find one used. And you can see I'm running the dual ignition setup. Well, I know a lot of people who race these in mini stocks. They plug the, I believe, the intake side and just run the exhaust, or vice versa. I can't remember. I've found it very useful racing off-road to have the redundancy of a dual ignition setup, because if for any reason one plug falls out, you still have the other one firing. And I have the ability to swap around inside the cab here with my control box. I can run off one side, the other, or both. So I generally run off both sides. It definitely idles better with a dual spark going. And then I've got it so that it cuts out about 3,500 RPMs. It switches to one side. That's my Gen V throttle body setup. That elaborate contraption on the top of the valve cover there is basically just my my vacuum monitor setup. That's my idle control bypass valve, and also my combined vacuum signal for the fuel injection for the Mega Squirt. I find that that's the only way I can get a stable vacuum reading for use with the Mega Squirt. I've actually got a little bit of a restrictor in the signal line that goes back to the fuel injection there, just to moderate the vacuum signal a little bit, adjust the response. You can adjust the response, and that's just basically a MIG welding tip. I think that's an 035 that I've used there as a restrictor. Works pretty well. Tuning this thing originally was quite a mess because of the throttle bodies being slightly oversized for this engine. I got, I think they're 40 millimeters if my memory holds right, which is a little bit large for this engine. Unless you're running all top end, they would be perfectly sized, but for mid-range power and coming off idle, a slightly smaller throttle body would actually help in that area quite a bit. I got a little bit more things I want to try on this. I want to put air horns inside this air box that I built, just to adjust the low end response a little bit more. It's actually running pretty good right now, especially right now. I just started it up for the first time on Saturday. It's the first time I've run this in 2 years. It's got 2-year-old gas on it, and it's actually running pretty good. So looking down the side of this old girl, this is originally a 1981 Datsun, was what this was built on. My original truck, my original race truck, was an 86 Nissan. That was my original Nissan that I bought when I was in the military in 1986. I rolled that truck pretty good back in 2005, and I've never gotten it back together again. It's sitting that. In the back, basically a stock leaf spring suspension with some extended shackles. I've got some custom bump stops there. They're actually Harley Davidson air shocks that I use as bump stops. They work pretty well, a lot cheaper. Got them mounted through a bracket on the frame to keep them in line with the axle, and they've worked out pretty well. I've had this set up on the truck for quite a few years. I can see one of my shocks is leaking a little bit, so it might be time for a new set of shocks. But I can adjust the pressure on those, which is nice. In the back here, I got FOAs. This is my main shock. And this is my fuel injection set up here for the supply side. It's coming off of a sump in the back of the engine. I got a Carter lift pump down in there that brings it up to the pre-filter water separator, and then to the high pressure pump for the fuel injection. And that stuff's all controlled through the Mega Squirt through some relays there. I got a little trans cooler there. Don't really need it that much for the short course racing I do, but it's been nice to have that a few times just to help regulate the temperature of the transmission. Old school Mastercraft seat there, probably 80s vintage. It's in rough shape. Still works though. That was the original seat in this truck from when Butch Litzinger raced this truck back in the 80s. It was, I believe, the very first race vehicle that he ever had. I bought this truck. It had just it had a 2.2 liter block sitting in it with no head on it. It looked like it was a brand new. Actually, it did have a head on it, but I pulled the head off, and the engine still had the crosshairs in the cylinders. So it looked like it was a crate engine. I don't think that's the engine he raced. It was also missing the Mikuni carbs that were supposed to be on it, but I had a set of those, and that's what I raced the first few years I had this. I raced with the Mikuni 44s. And there's front suspension. I got dual coilovers. It's sprung tight. It's really sprung heavy, and it's on the top arm just because it's so hard to find any place else to run shocks on these for racing. My long-term plan is to go with a long travel wide front end, and then put a single coil through the A-arm, and probably a yoke around the drive axle so I can mount the lower arm on this. I'll show you the work that I did. Patrick, this is the setup I did to use the newer axles and newer spindles on the old suspension setup. That's the new style spindle with extensions on the top, which I like. I like the geometry of the old style suspension much better than the later ones. It just works so much better off-road. Gives you more control over your suspension geometry and better angles in general. But that's a solid, I believe, 1.5 inch round stock that was drilled and tapped. A bolt was run through the bottom through the original ball joint hole that was drilled out for the biggest bolt. I think it's a 3/4 inch bolt. I can't remember. I believe that was a 3/4 inch bolt. And then it was welded top and bottom around the bolt. And then that solid round stock goes all the way through that 1/2 inch top plate, or 3/4 inch top plate. And it's welded top and bottom. And then that's I believe a 3/8 inch gusset welded to the outside there. And then that top plate was drilled and reamed for the I think it was a 7-degree ball joint angle for this. So that's actually an aftermarket ball joint, but it's an aftermarket adjustable pre-tension ball joint, but it's just like a stock one. And they're actually very similar to the Hummer ball joints actually. But that's how I did that, and I was able to use, now I can use the later axles with this setup. And the only thing I had to do, I swapped the long axle on the opposite side and the short axle on this side. I was able to tweak that front bracket just enough to move the differential over to get the correct spacing for these axles. I didn't have to cut that bracket loose or anything. I just tweaked the tabs of that bracket over, and I was able to get that positioned and then I tweak the back end a little bit to keep it straight. But that's how I managed to get new axles and new spindles into an old style truck. So let me know if you guys want to see anything else that I missed. But that's what the old girl looks like right now. She's a little rough. It's been a while since I ran her or did any serious work or cleanup on this truck. Just have not had the time to do it. But she's gonna get run this Friday night, so wish me luck. All right, take it easy.